Gives me great pleasure indeed to welcome to the stage Mary Beard and Barnaby Rogerson, who are going to be having a conversation about Pompeii. A very warm round of applause, please, for Mary Beard and Barnaby Rogerson. Thank you.
Let me just see if it works. Where do I point it? Yeah, let's have the first slide. Just.
Good afternoon. I've got a very intimate story to tell you about Mary Beard. I'm over 50, and my two daughters decided I've got enough objects in life. I should go travelling. But they threatened me with Euro Disney and a helicopter skiing journey. And I said, if you take me to Disneyland, I will cut my throat in front of you. But they wouldn't reveal what it was. Months of planning. We arrived at this London station, and I was given a little parcel and a train ticket, and inside was Mary Beard's Pompeii and a glass of champagne, and it was an amazing opening to me, which I then read on the train and then arrived knowing Pompeii, as it were, through Mary Beard's eyes and mind. And what a journey it is, and what a book it is. But Mary, I'm afraid, has got it all. For 27 years, she's taught classics in what has to be one of the most iconic universities of the world, Cambridge. There's beautiful medieval spas and lawns. But she breaks all the conventional role models of a classics professor. She's also an assistant editor in the TLS, so gets to lunch in Soho. She also writes a blog that goes all over the world. She is, of course, familiar from television and lectures, and has literally empowered tens of thousands of students into the classics. But unlike the male professors who bullied me in my childhood, her job is not to use knowledge to cosh young boys, but to open up an extraordinary, exciting world. And perhaps being a woman, she's less interested in the handover of power and more getting into the mentality of the classical world. I mean, her interests include the imagery of power, the portraiture of the Caesars, of the Colosseum, of the great temples, the sort of living archaeology of a triumphal procession. And typically, her current level of research is into the causes of classical laughter. What made the classical man and woman and slave and serf break out into hysterics. But we're going to now ask Mary if she could sort of summon up to our audience, what is the appeal of Pompeii? Why is it such a sort of cultural icon for all of Europe and perhaps the whole world?
The whole world, I think. Yeah. First, can I say thank you very much, Barnaby. That was over generous. There will be, in the course of this, some PowerPoint slides going up on these screens. We've been very aware that there are people sitting at the back who may not see them so easily. So they are not, they're not absolutely necessary. If you can't see what's on the screen very well, don't worry. We'll be talking in a way that will make it comprehensible nevertheless. You'll also have seen, because I've got a PowerPoint together, that I have had a preview of the questions that Barnaby is going to ask. They're not just random. Anyway, what's the appeal of Pompeii? Well, I think that, in part, it is the appeal of the disaster movie. You have to admit that the idea of the sudden destruction of a town by a volcano 2,000 years ago, has got almost all the ingredients of movie and novelistic excitement. And I think that's, for the last 200 years, that is why, painters and novelists and movie makers, there's a great movie there, have tried to recapture that sense of doom. It was terribly, terribly exciting to the Victorians somehow because it represented the potential punishment of a decadent ancient city by a righteous God who was about to bring Christianity into the world, good and proper. And Bulwer Lytton's novel called The Last Days of Pompeii is absolutely brilliant at that. It was a 19th century bestseller, and of course the only two people to survive the eruption are indeed the two Christians in Pompeii. Everybody else gets flattened. But I think that more than that, and I don't want to kind of ignore that. I like Pompeii movies, and I like reading Robert Harris's novel and wondering who's going to survive. But I think the other thing which really gets Pompeii going for people is that it is the one place in the whole world where you can actually go and get really, really close, sometimes too close for comfort, to Roman daily life. It is, in a way, it's like walking into a town 2,000 years ago and seeing what daily life was like. And recently there was an exhibition at the British Museum which was called Life and Death in Pompeii and Herculaneum, its neighbouring town. And that rather captured, I think, the modern mood. It was one of the biggest selling exhibitions the British Museum had ever had. And the idea of saying life and death rather than death and life, Pompeii's usually about death, the idea of saying life and death actually encouraged people to say, look, what can we find out from Pompeii about how people actually lived? And it's been a success not only in the UK, but a movie was made of the exhibition, which has gone all over the world, from the north of Scotland to Australia via Mumbai, actually trying again to capture not the grisly dead bodies, but what you can actually see of really everyday life. And it's some of the simplest things, I think, that really get people going. And if you go to Pompeii and you ask people when they're coming out of the site, what do you remember? Every single person will tell you, I remember the cart ruts in the street. You can walk down a street and there's a cart rut, and there's, you are walking on a street with ruts made by real ancient carts. So although there are kind of all sorts of other really exciting things, my experience of asking people, why do you get off on Pompeii? Top of the list is it's being really in the steps of ancient Romans. And there's also, the pleasure, some of these things I think are pretty obvious, the pleasure of seeing the stuff they had on their walls. There's a pleasure of walking into the only surviving brothel in the ancient world. Now, I think the decadence of Pompeii has, I'm afraid, or I'm pleased to say, been rather overestimated, but it is true that there is a real live 5-cubicle, a real dead 5-cubicle ancient brothel that you can still visit. This also, I have to say, is one of the highlights of the modern site. And I try telling people when they come out, there's queues to get into it now. I always have to say, this is more popular now than it was in 79 AD,
Rather narrow beds.
They're extremely narrow beds. But people have, I couldn't possibly tell you what the graffiti say on the walls, but there are hundreds of graffiti, which if you were doubtful that it was an ancient brothel, say in much fruitier Latin, I had a great time with X here, over and over and over again. In fact, funnily, the last written surviving version of evidence for the pre-Latin language of this part of Italy, the language of Oscan, the last trace of written Oscan is on the wall of the brothel. With somebody saying, I had a good time here in Oscan. And it seems to be a kind of wonderful example of how a language dies. It finally ends up just, scrawling a sexual graffiti in a brothel. But you also get, and I think here is you get an idea which you can't replace, I think, anywhere else in the ancient world. You get an idea of what these people in Pompeii thought about their world. And I think one of the things that has most struck me, and I think it gets people going too, is the idea that here we are in a hick little town, very unimportant little town in South Italy, but their imaginations are wild, and you get their version of what they thought Egypt looked like. And as I talked about yesterday, if any of you were here, one of the most interesting discoveries is an Indian statuette from a fairly ordinary house in Pompeii. A statuette which I think we have to imagine was brought back by somebody who was involved directly or indirectly in the trade between the Roman Empire and India. But you also get, you get the real stuff of everyday life. You get the bars and you get the lavatories. This, if you can see it, is a Roman chamber pot. Made obviously for a rather capacious bottom. It has flanges to hold you up as you sit on it. So you see absolutely everything, from eating and drinking to sex, going to the lavatory, crossing the street. And I think as much as disaster movie stuff, I think it's that people really want to see. You read about the Roman Empire, and it is a bit generals and emperors and toffs and posh people. Yeah. Pompeii is a place where you can actually hold a chamber pot that some ordinary Roman sat on, and I think that's its appeal.
And what sort of size are we talking of the town? What sort of...
I thought you meant what sort of size the chamber pot, Barnaby. Normal size, the chamber pot.
But the size of Pompeii, its population, have we...
Well, so I think the thing that's quite difficult to know, I mean, yes, it's very immediate. Yes, you can go and sort of, hold the potty. It's much harder when you go to the second order of questions and you say, what sort of town was this then? Okay, I can see the bars and I can see the lavatories and I can go to the brothel, but what kind of place are we dealing with, And that, I think, has been, in all sorts of ways, really, really puzzling for people. I mean, if you put a map of the town on, doesn't tell you very much, and I could, if I looked it up, give you how many hectares it was, but basically you can walk across it in 20 minutes. So it's a smallish place, but not tiny. Its biggest characteristic, I suspect, is that it is extremely ordinary. If it had not been destroyed, almost certainly we would have known nothing about it. Now, a few specialists might have come across its name, but it's, in some ways, what's so fascinating about it is it's such an unimportant place. That we're really looking, I mean, when I'm in England, I say, this is a bit like Letchworth, and that sort of captures it. It is a place that is probably very nice, ordinary, simple place, but utterly insignificant. But the question then comes, and is how you can, people then say, well, how many people lived there? And you'd have thought that was a very simple question. You'd have thought that you could look at bits of the town, you can plan most of it, some of it is still unexcavated, but you can get a detailed plan of it. You would have thought that with all the houses and the rooms marked, you could do a pretty easy calculation on how many people. Is it a big place? Not big place. Well, the answer is that the estimates of how many people live there range between 6,000 and 30,000. We simply do not know. Now, I think it tells you quite a lot about the place if you think why it is we don't know. I mean, I think population is, in some ways, does it matter? Doesn't matter very much. But the processes people have gone through to try to work it out, I think, are quite interesting. And one of the things they do is they start with the amphitheatre. There's a nice amphitheatre in Pompeii, which presumably had nice little gladiators fighting in it, and there's graffiti on the walls of Pompeii showing gladiators. People go to the amphitheatre with their tape measures, and they measure it up, and they say, what's the seating capacity? And they come to say, well, if you think of it as a kind of budget airline amphitheatre, so a bit squashed, it's about 20,000. If it's a kind of club class amphitheatre, probably about 15,000, right? So you say, okay, 20,000 people in the amphitheatre, that must tell you something. Then you start to say, but when was it ever full? And then you also start to say, but if you've got the amphitheatre, it hasn't only got people who live in Pompeii coming to it, it's got people from outside. And actually the one time that Pompeii makes it into the historical record is when there is a fight in the amphitheatre, not between the gladiators, but between the local Pompeians and the visiting spectators from the town of Nuceria, a few miles away. And they have a fight in the amphitheatre, which was so important that somebody decided to represent it on their walls of their house, but also Tacitus, the Roman historian, writes about it. So we have a sense that we've got quite a big space of popular entertainment here, but it doesn't help us get very far in knowing about who's local or not. And that kind of basic problem goes throughout the town. And what you've got on the screen now is a sort of typical upper range house, right? This is a, relatively, nobody in Pompeii is that rich. But this is the kind of big house, spacious open courtyard, rooms off, that if you were pretty wealthy, you'd live in. There have been enormous numbers of discussion about how many people would have lived in a house that size. Is it a nuclear family plus a couple of slaves? Or is it kind of steaming and stuffed to the gills with extended family and granny, uncle and auntie, ex-slaves? And the key question here is we have almost no clue in Pompeii about the upper floors. So you have a real problem about knowing really how big it is, because if you walk through Pompeii now, you'd think basically every bit of activity happened on ground floor. But actually, as you go through the town and you watch out, you can see all sorts of stairways going up. They're truncated. Question is, the big question, and it's the population question for Pompeii, is what happened upstairs at Pompeii? And some people think it was just attics, where you kept stuff. Other people imagine it's the dormitories for the slaves and dependents and his upper story flats. And that's how you get, if you want to get to 30,000, that's how you get there. If you imagine it's where you kept your spare blankets for the winter, you're down to 6,000. So it's really very interesting, I think, to think, you think you've got everything here, and you have. In some ways it's, modern jargon, it's the gritty reality of Roman life, but try and ask the bigger questions, and there are always these puzzles. And population is absolute classic puzzle.
And you were mentioning it's not about the squatting element outside classical towns. That's, again, not known.
Well, I said to an archaeologist friend of mine the other day, how would you, if you wanted to, could you disprove that outside the perimeter walls of Pompeii there was a large squatter settlement? Could you show that that was not the case? And he said, no, you couldn't show that was not the case. And I think one of the things that makes you wonder about the periphery of the town and the idea that what we see is not the whole of the settlement is that, never mind the brothel, there are so many bars in Pompeii. There are just too many bars for 6,000 people. They're very recognisable. They have counters like this, bowls set in them, presumably serving dry food, presumably also serving, wine and possibly beer. There's hundreds, and quite a lot of Pompeii doesn't sort of add up. then that's one of the things. If you've only got 6,000 residents, you've got a hell of a problem with what you're doing in the bar.
Yeah.
Or they're completely dipso, I think.
And what are the other major problems that archaeologists and your colleagues are working on?
Well, I have to say archaeologists can be a bit boring about Pompeii. I shouldn't say that. And if you want to know what the really fashionable subject was, it's, I think, one of the least interesting, and that is, what was the early settlement of Pompeii actually like? We see it in 79 AD, as the volcano has come over it. But what was it like 400 years earlier? So what they're currently doing is digging down in the little spaces they've got to find out what the earliest Pompeii was like. Now, I'm sure this is, in all sorts of ways, extremely interesting, but it doesn't particularly interest me. And I think it overlooks quite a lot of sort of bigger problems, really, and bigger but simpler problems. And one of the simplest and most puzzling issues, actually, is particularly in the public buildings. The houses is a slightly different matter, but in the public buildings, we haven't really the foggiest clue what these buildings were for. And when you look at your guidebook, most guidebooks will tell you, they will give a name to a building and they will tell you something, right? You should always be very, very careful of anybody telling you what an ancient building was used for. And even if you go to the forum in the centre, the piazza, the big public piazza in the centre, is planned there, you'd think that right at the very middle, we would know what these buildings were. Well, in the case of a few, we do. We can recognise what a temple looks like, so we can spot some religious buildings. So we're not hopelessly ignorant, but we're ignorant about some of the really major other buildings that you find there in really, with really, really divergent answers. And here what I've shown you on the screen is the entranceway to the biggest building off the Roman Forum. It's a building that was bankrolled by a woman, in fact, a woman called Eumachia, and we know she bankrolled it because there's a statue of her inside it, put up by the local laundry workers, honouring her. And there, if you can see, that's a little 19th century cork model of what it is, but basically, if you can't see, it's just an open courtyard with a walkway, colonnade around, and a statue of Lady Eumachia at one end, but it's vast. Now, guesses about what this is veer from it was the trade union centre of the laundry workers, hence they put the statue up, to it was the slave trade locus, right? Now, there's plenty of other in-betweens. The wool workers come in. Now, in some ways, that sort of doesn't matter. It's a big building, some communal function. Does it matter what it was? Well, it sort of gives you a different view of ancient life. If you think this is the kind of town where the laundry workers put up a whacking great sort of trade union centre at one side of the square, that's a very different sort of town than if this is where thousands of slaves were brought to be bought and sold. And further up, if you go further up to the top of the forum, there's another building which looks like that now. It's got a little temple at one end. It's got a kind of a sort of funny shaped, sort of almost circular things with 12 columns in the middle of it. Now, every guidebook you now have will tell you that's the fish market, the meat and fish market. And they'll say it's got to be the fish market because underneath what looks like those 12 columns were found enormous numbers of fish bones. So that must have been a little kind of shelter where the poor slaves would sit and gut the fish, take the bones out, and they got left behind. And they'd sold the meat at the top. and there's another model of it. The trouble is that, well, that has certainly not been the solution to what it was that people have always had. And in the Victorian period, there's an image here on the screen, the Victorian period, it was thought to be a temple of the 12 gods. And these little 12 supports for the pergola were thought to be 12 supports for statues of the 12 Olympian gods. Now, most people now reject that, and they say, how stupid of the 19th century, how stupid to think that it was a temple. You know, it's obviously a market, isn't it? Well, it may have been a market, but if it was a market, you have to explain what the thing that really does look like a temple at one end is, and you also have to explain why it has such luscious decoration. You know, most fish markets don't have decoration of this kind of scale. In fact, the first person who wrote a guidebook to Pompeii, a rather eccentric English scholar called William Gell, he had a better idea. He said, look, we're in Italy, it's big piazza here. What does every Italian piazza have? It has a cafe. So in Gell's guidebook, this is the cafe. There it is, nice cafe. Don't know what the central bit was. So, you know, I think really the puzzles are, they're bigger than what happened in 400 BC. They are, again, like population, just going a bit further and saying, so what was this building actually doing there? You know, what was it for?
And what other sort of modern myths need puncturing? You've got the sort of...
Well, the big myth you've got to get out of your head, I think absolutely definitely got to get out of your head, is that immediate as it is, Pompeii was not a city kind of suddenly frozen in time. We were not there in August 79 AD and we were walking through the streets, going about our daily business and suddenly we're zapped, oh my goodness me, and all frozen there for us to find. Now, there are some indications that there is a bit of surprise. You get bread still in the oven. Some poor baker is still baking on the morning of the eruption. You get, the baby was found in this cradle, and can't quite see what that is actually. You do get bodies. About in Pompeii and Herculaneum together, you get about 1,000 bodies are found. But what we know for certain is that these guys had quite a lot of warning that the eruption was coming, and anybody with any sense had left town. Now, one of the reasons that it's quite hard to know what the buildings were for is because not much is found in them. Okay, they didn't take the fish bones away with them, but, the valuables, the property, got carted off. So it makes it much harder to work out. If you've got a building without many contents, it's harder to work out what it was doing. And the other thing that I think you have to remember, and this might seem a bit of a downer, but you walk into Pompeii now and it does, I love it. It feels like you're walking back into real houses. You're going, there's roofs. It's like stepping back into the ancient world. They have been very, very, very heavily restored. When Pompeii is excavated, it looks like what you see on the screen. It looks a complete tip. And that's what they turn it into when they restore it. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for doing that. You can't leave an excavation like that. That actually helps people appreciate it. It preserves it. But we are encouraged to have an image that, as if it's all somehow there. And I've sat around Pompeii with not much to do quite often. And I hear people come in and they say, "Isn't it amazing? Even the roof has survived." And you kind of think, do I say no, or do I or that spoil it? So it depends what mood I'm in. So I think it's a place where there's been a lot of modern work. It's like, you know, like facial work. You know, there's been a lot of work done on Pompeii to make it like it is for us. It's quite interesting to look at the history of that, but it isn't quite what it seems.
And when you're working all these years over Pompeii, what are the sort of intimate discoveries and personal sort of find spots that still resonate? Well,
you get all sorts of intimate discoveries in Pompeii. But I think that there was one thing that really, really surprised me. And in fact, it wasn't actually to do with the ancient history of the town at all. It was the fact, what I had never realised, and this map shows you the sites, but you won't be able to see it, that in 1943, the Allies, i.e. the British and their friends, bombed it to bits. They thought that there were Germans hiding out there, and there might have been, but they decided that they would shell it. They dropped shell after shell, and that is what Pompeii looked like where the British shells had dropped. And it's nicely restored like that, but actually not only was it destroyed by a volcano, it was then destroyed by the British, and then it's been reconstructed. They even got the gate on the way into the town, which again is now restored like that. So when, I think the Americans had something to do with it as well, when the British press now gets frightfully uppity, as it tends to, about the state of preservation of Pompeii, the Italians can't be trusted, with looking after this World Heritage Site, there are too many people, it's crumbling, walls keep falling down, how disgusting, the mafia are involved, they get frightfully high moral tone about it. All you have to do is to say, so who bombed it then? And that usually shuts them up.
And with all this restoration and this sort of imagination and your work of popularising, I mean, what's the future as the whole world, China, now wants to travel? How can cities, how can places like this cope?
I mean, we all know, every country has its sites with visitor overload. And we all know what that's like. We all know how in some ways that spoils those sites. It damages them and spoils them. I'm not too gloomy about Pompeii. I think it'd be a very good idea to entice visitors away from Pompeii itself into some of the equally interesting sites around about. But I think that, I don't get too worried when walls fall down, because I think, look, 1/3 of this site is still happily and safely underground, and it can stay there, and future generations can excavate it, and they can have that bit for them. We should do what we can, but, it was a jerry-built town that's been destroyed by a volcano and then bombed by the British. Do we actually expect it to last forever? It's not going to last forever. My house, in 2,000 years' time will not look half as good, as it'll be invisible. And I think, what I hate is the idea that somehow it'll be put off limits to people. There'll be some replica built 5 miles down the road, and normal people go to the replica, and a few academics and celebs go to the real thing. So we divide Pompeii up between those who are allowed really to go there and those who have to make do with a replica. I think, a bit of common sense. Don't excavate anymore. Leave that for the future. Do what you can, but don't get too worried about it. And, in the end, I think there will be a kind of self-righting mechanism. If too many people go, it will become an unpleasant visitor experience. And as long as you can actually offer people equal interesting things to do, you can probably manage it without building a plastic Pompeii somewhere else, which is, I'm afraid, one of the suggestions.
Could there be any threshold of quizzes to get in? I mean, when I've gone there, people are bored. You think, stay away. This is a passionate place.
I don't know. You see, I think that some people, you take a party, you take 20 12-year-olds, and you know, some of them might be bored, but in those 20, 12-year-olds, there'll be 2 for whom it's a life-changing experience, and you won't know before you take them which 2 it's going to be.
Yeah.
And, you know, people also, they get things out of going to a site like that, which is sometimes the immediate experience at the time. Sometimes I don't think they're enjoying it, but later on it sort of clicks. And, you know, if we start to kind of hierarchize, you know, only the clever, the interested, the knowledgeable, the rich and the famous can go here, then I think we've probably ruined the subject for the future.
And you had a personal epiphany, didn't you? I mean, you got switched on, age 5, or...
I went to the British Museum when I was 5. My mum took me. We lived miles away. She thought I ought to go to London because I hadn't never seen a big city. She took me to the British Museum, and I saw 2 things. One was the Elgin marbles. I shouldn't call them that, the Parthenon marbles, I should say. And I was just gobsmacked. I hadn't realised that people 2,500 years earlier could do things like that. I just didn't know. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Yeah. Then I went to look, as every child wants to, at the Egyptian collection. I want to see the mummies. Everybody wants to see the mummies. And I went to one of the cases. I was little, I couldn't quite see in. And my mum was trying to lift me up so I could see, because inside there was a bit, you know, of carbonised cake from, you know, presumably 3000 BC. I was trying to see it. A guy came along who must have been a curator, came along and he could see that I was trying to look desperately in. He got a key out, he opened the case, and he brought the cake out for me to look at. And I thought, wow, not only was the cake amazing, but it was the kind of moral I was trying to make, really, that, you know, if you open these things up to people, it impacts with them, actually. It really does. You know, I don't know who that guy was, but he made me think not only that the ancient world was interesting, but that people would let you touch it. And
your interest as a 5-year-old was totally valid.
It was. You know, and you might have thought, why should she see the cake? Well, look, you know, this is where I ended up. That cake has got a lot to be answerable.
And that would be a very good note to open up to any questions. Make them brief and very clear.
And not too difficult.
As a student of history, I've come to observe that Italy has more been identified with Renaissance. So although there's no direct comparison possible, do you think for Italian culture, which is more important, Pompeii or medieval Florence or somewhere?
Well, I think in some ways they go together. You know, they're inextricably bound. Sorry, that sounds like an easy way out. But, you know, what the Renaissance was a rebirth of not exactly what Pompeii represented. It wasn't a rebirth of the brothels of Pompeii, but it was a rebirth of of ancient Roman culture. So I think that, you know, I think they're both extremely important, but Renaissance Florence would not mean anything unless we also knew about the Romans. It needs the Romans more than the Romans need it.
Mary, thank you so much for such an absorbing discussion. I just wanted to know what kind of religious practices were followed during those times. Can you shed some light on the temples and the temple architecture?
Yeah.
Another quick question about the institutions of teaching and learning.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
The religious practice is extremely varied. The point about, you know, the main point about Roman paganism is it is, with some notable exceptions, Judaism and Christianity, it is a very incorporating and welcoming, in inverted commas, polytheism. So what you find in Pompeii, again, it's quite hard to know in some cases which god lived in which temple, but you find a variety of different temples which include deities which we believe are more or less native traditional Roman deities, but there is a fantastic temple of the Egyptian goddess Isis, extraordinarily Egyptian-style decoration, which was actually excavated in the end of the 18th century, and the young Mozart visited it, and it partly sparked off his interest in strange religions that went into the magic flute. And it is not, I slightly poured cold water about there being 2 Christians in Pompeii who escaped, but it is not impossible that there was already some element of Christianity. St. Paul came up the Italian coast, and this was destroyed in 79. There are certainly traces of Judaism, because we have, the Romans ate, their particular staple was rotten fish sauce. Really horrible stuff called garum, made out of decayed fish. We found 1 jar of it, which says kosher garum on it. So it must have been guaranteed no shellfish. So there is a vast profusion of, and people say the Roman Empire was a world full of gods, and I think Pompeii was very much that. Teaching and learning, we know there are schools. We've got, they don't have designated buildings. It appears that they meet in sort of open spaces in these kind of courtyards. One of the things that almost certainly happened in the Forum was that masters lined the kids up under the colonnade to teach them, because we have a picture of a surviving painting of activities in the Roman Forum, and in one of them there's a master with a class, and there's one guy getting one poor kid getting horribly beaten by the master, presumably for not learning his grammar or something. So there clearly are institutions of teaching and learning, but because there is no designated schools, or so far as we know, it's quite hard to plot them.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, why hasn't it been more fully excavated, and what type of things you might expect to find if it was?
It hasn't all been fully excavated, partly originally because it's very expensive. It's an extremely expensive activity, and it started to be excavated under the Bourbon monarchy, and even the Bourbon monarchy needed a bit of spare change to get the workmen, get the staff, house it. So that's been really kind of structural and economic. Pompeii, Herculaneum is very difficult to excavate, very, very expensive. It's covered with a different sort of volcanic deposit. It's very, very hard, and it's really difficult. Pompeii is not all that deeply buried, and it's quite loose stuff, but even so, it's pricey. Now I think what people think is it's a good idea it hasn't been all excavated, because being buried keeps it safe. And it does give us a bit of freedom to do what we want with the stuff we've got, knowing that we're not ruining it for every future generation. If you say, what would you expect to find, or what would you hope to find? I think it's not perhaps so much I'd hope to find in terms of new sorts of buildings. I mean, certainly a lot of people would love a Christian church there, but I don't doubt you get that. I think it would be that when we excavate now, we'll be excavating with much, much greater fine-grained scientific analysis possible, so that whereas people before used to, they didn't even notice that in the stuff they were chucking away were seeds, all kinds of floral and faunal stuff that they could analyse. And also there's a potential now for DNA analysis, that you'd be able to do much more with it in terms of thinking about the whole environment of Pompeii. There is a bit of work done on the old stuff, what plants grew there, what the gardens were like, but you'd be able to do much more with that.
Evidences in the form of frescoes there are said to be the first, advertising remnants visible, particularly in the form of red wine being, I think, if I remember correctly, at some 13th building. Those frescoes talk about specifically, the red wine being sold there, and then probably some paintings which talks about the brothels there, and probably those kind of trades were being advertised on the frescoes there. What's your take on that?
Well, what's quite interesting is that there's painting of all sorts in Pompeii, and some of the painting is clearly commercial. You know, you have a bar. One of the things you do to advertise your product is you have a picture of what you're selling and you got the price, right? And paintings are in some senses the advertising hoardings of the ancient world. But the ones that are particularly interesting are the ones you mentioned in the brothel, because over each one of these 5 doors into the cubicles in the brothel, there's a painting of some different form of sex going on. And if you listen to the guides showing people around, they say, this is a bit like McDonald's. What you have to do is, possibly people came here from abroad, this is on the coast, after all, they perhaps didn't speak Latin or Oscan, and so what they do is they point to what they wanted, and then they get the girl in that room. Now, this seems to me extremely unlikely, and much more likely is that in this very dingy, shabby little establishment, the painting is trying to kind of somehow suggest that this is a glamorous erotic encounter. In fact, it's a seedy little brothel, but the painting sort of takes you into a world of rather more upmarket eroticism. And you know, it's very funny. It is kind of the brothel itself is a very interesting site in modern tourism to visit, because it is the most popular place. There are queues to go in, and it is where you see kind of cultural machismo. It is, but everybody's saying "car," you know. So you try and say, what would it like being a prostitute here? Excuse me. You know, look at it. Look, it's a 4x4 kind of, and we all put ourselves, even the women, even me. I'm as guilty as anybody. We put ourselves in the position of the punter, not in the position of the prostitute. So, and that goes with the, I'll have, can I have 2 portions of number 4, please? Thanks to the painting. We've got time for...
My question to you is that, do you think the restoration of Pompeii, like you told us that it's been heavily restored, so do you think it's not loyal to the idea of Pompeii because there's a chance you might have got something wrong?
So I didn't get the actual question. Can you just repeat the very...
Do you think that the heavy restoration of Pompeii might not actually be loyal to the idea of Pompeii because there's a chance you might have got something wrong?
I think in some cases it is wrong. I think in some cases it is. On balance, I think it's worth doing. Partly because it isn't really gross. It's basically re-erecting and putting a roof on. And I think that has helped people get a lot out of it. It helps me get a lot out of it. But also, you've got to put something over it. If you want to leave things in situ and not take them off to the museum, you've got to cover it from the elements. So, it's a double bind here, honestly, I think. And certainly I was very struck by reading accounts of visitors to Pompeii in the middle of the 19th century, because all the restoration really starts in the 1880s, 90s, and has gone on ever since. More visitors to Pompeii in the 1850s are disappointed with what they see than are pleased. The novelist James Fenimore Cooper went there, and he said, I have to confess, after all I'd read about it, I was disappointed when I actually saw it. And there was a guy, an academic from Cambridge, who said, God, it looks like a town that's just been destroyed by the French, he said, in 1830. And of course, it was. If you leave Pompeii like it's, like it actually is uncovered, it looks like a town that's been destroyed by a volcano. And in a way, that's interesting, and it might be nice to leave a bit of that so people could see. But I'm broadly in favour of restoring it. However, the trouble now is that the late 19th century restoration is now crumbling. You know, so part of the problem with the collapses is it's not the sort of original, it's the sort of rebuild that is collapsing. So it's, you know, it's very hard to be a purist about Pompeii, I think.
I believe that when the Bourbons excavated, they took a lot of the choicest bits back to Naples. Is there a case for taking them back to Pompeii? The second thing is, were things actually sold off to the private sector? People like Sir William Hamilton, I think, may have got their hands on a few bits and pieces. Is there much in the public domain that one could buy, in fact?
Two things there. The Bourbons did take a lot off to their museum. And the conventional archaeological wisdom is to say, tut, tut, taking it out of context. The truth is that the stuff in the museum is much better preserved than the stuff on site. There was a bit of a move in the late 19th century to put things back from the museum onto the site. The only thing that actually got put back was that famous mosaic which says "Beware of the dog."
Yes.
Carwe Canem. That actually was moved back from the museum. Did things get into the private sector? Yes, certainly. They certainly did. I came across quite a lot of snobbishness about that, actually, when I was doing some work on it. Both things were clearly sold by clandestine excavation. There was private excavation. The famous Villa of the Mysteries, with a really famous painting, was actually a private excavation by the local innkeeper originally. But also things were given away to visiting dignitaries. And you go through the record books of the archaeological authorities, and Crown Prince, someone comes along and he gets given a load of goodies to take off with him. And the one really sad bit, I thought they came out very badly after I'd been reading letter after letter saying, I think we'll give, Grand Duke so-and-so this. There was a little letter from the mayor of a small town in England, the town of Reading, writing to the archaeological authorities to say that he was starting an archaeological association in the late 19th century. His town was very interested in Pompeii. Perhaps they could send him, some small fragment of pottery and a piece of lava so he could show around. And he got such a snooty letter back saying, we don't give things away. And, actually, they were giving things away the whole time to people who had a title.
Yeah. Should we have one more question? And then that could probably...
Yes, you mentioned the only historical record was the two groups fighting in the Forum. Surely the Roman historians, didn't they describe the
eruption.
The volcano and what happened after the event? I did have another quick brothel question. Were all the images in the brothel, were they all heterosexual? Were there homosexual?
That is very interesting. I'm a bit unfair because we have scientific notes of the eruption and the places that are destroyed, and we have the famous letter of Pliny written to his friend, the historian Tacitus. Pliny had been a little boy when Vesuvius erupted, and in fact his grandfather, the extremely prolific elder Pliny, died in the eruption, and Pliny does describe it. So I suppose what I meant to be more accurate is if it had not been destroyed, all we know about it is that there was a nasty fight in the amphitheatre, basically. There is a considerable debate both about the brothel paintings and about other paintings in town, whether any of the sex scenes show any form of non-heterosexual sex. It's absolutely clear that the vast majority are heterosexual. There are some paintings which have been claimed to be male homoeroticism. If you want to know more about that, there's a great book by a guy called John Clark called Looking at Lovemaking. And he is very keen to find homosexual encounters in paintings, and any that can be argued for, Clarke has argued. So if you want to track down homosexuality in Roman painting, John Clarke is your man.
On that wonderful note, I think we all would love to join Mary's class in Cambridge and can see the enchantment of her as a writer and communicator.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mary and Barnaby, on this wonderful insight into the Temple of Pompeii. Thank you so very much.